In the heart of Transylvania, Romania, lies an unusual forest that has been likened to Skinwalker Ranch in America. Not only in the folklore of old, but it has also become an epicenter of a series of bizarre events and reports in more recent times. The Hoia Baciu forest itself is situated here, next to the city of Cluj-Napoca, the unofficial capital of Transylvania, which is the home to some incredible Gothic architecture. There is a very old site situated in close proximity to the forest that was inhabited by natives around 8,000 years ago. It's thought that something terrible happened to those that called this place home. Evidence suggests that a rival tribe had attacked and chased them into the forest where they would come to meet their end. Beginning in the 1960s and going on until the 1990s, various excavation teams went in and found all manner of things belonging to this tribe. The remnants of their homes, grave sites and other such things that painted the picture of something terrible happening to them. The way in which the forest gained its name also has foreboding origins, and it's not completely clear when exactly it was named. Rough estimates suggest somewhere between the 13th and 15th century. Hoia is the name of the area, and Baci means shepherd in Romanian. There are mentions in the folklore warning about entering this place. One lone shepherd, that was known as a great outdoorsman, apparently had ignored these warnings at some point all those years ago. He, along with his flock of 200 sheep, while trying to keep them together, had strayed and navigated towards the edge of this woodland. This man was known to have spent much of his life among the mountains and forests and wasn't a stranger to these kinds of wilderness areas. The folklore states that as he got further and further into the woodland, the sounds of life stopped and was replaced by a gradual stillness and silence. The birds had stopped chirping and leaves had stopped rustling with the wind. He became aware of this stillness and could see a clearing through the trees. This clearing, as described, was free of vegetation and was a perfect circle where nothing grew. The shepherd, along with the entire flock, vanished that day. Some versions of this story depict that around the time that he went missing, local villagers had heard a low humming sound coming from the forest and associated this with his disappearance. There's no real conclusion to the story though as to what actually happened to this shepherd, only that he and his 200-strong flock did not return. The villagers were said to have made a respectable search effort in scope when he failed to return, but his whereabouts nor his remains were ever discovered. One way or another though, this is thought to be the origin of the name for this place. As you might imagine, given the story, there are those from this place that believe something completely out of the ordinary happened to this man, and there is something off with the area itself. Other suggestions lean towards something more grounded and relatable to us. During the times the shepherd was around, banditry would have been rampant and a real problem in more isolated areas away from authority. Some people believe that this shepherd, whoever he was, found himself in the wrong place at the wrong time. Either a robbery gone wrong, or he was purposefully disposed of and his flock essentially stolen. 200 sheep would have been an incredibly valuable prize to have claimed, especially back then. Something else that is noteworthy is that this clearing in the forest where nothing grows does actually exist within the woodland. Locals call it Poiana Rotunda, which means round clearing. This circular area is in the southwestern section of the forest and is around 250 to 300 feet across and remains completely devoid of plant life. This area has fascinated both the locals and researchers for years, as they don't quite understand why nothing grows in that particular spot. It's an odd sight because while the clearing is barren, it is surrounded by lush greenery on all sides. There have been attempts to understand why this is the case, but as far as I can tell, it is something that is not currently understood. I came across an interesting report from the 18th of August 1999 where a group of 5 hikers, all long-time friends with one another, had been interested in this site for a while and had decided to go and explore it together. They'd been hiking for most of the day already and it was getting dark, but they decided to continue on with their plan of entering the forest. According to them, they had made it fairly deep inside, and while they couldn't see the clearing yet, they were nearing it. In the report, the hikers stated that as they got closer to it, there was an abrupt drop in temperature, which is interesting because it was the summer firstly, and according to them it seemed to be localised to that specific spot. When it initially happened, they didn't think too much of it, and some of them just put extra layers on from their backpacks and continued trekking towards the clearing. There would be another oddity, however. Again, as they got closer, it states that the person in front stopped without saying anything and showed the others that the compass was just spinning erratically. This put some of them off going any further because they were now worried about getting turned around and having to waste a bunch of time getting out. But ultimately, they decided to carry on. It was then noticed by one, and then the others, that the battery on their mobile phones had been depleted much quicker than was expected. This could of course just be coincidental, and perhaps they had just lost track of time. But in the report, it appears as though they felt it was linked to these other oddities that they'd experienced in the forest. As they pressed onwards, they reported hearing sounds in the underbrush, and they thought that they were being surrounded by wildlife, leaving them startled. While the chances of encountering dangerous wildlife within the forest are quite low, there have been instances in the past where brown bears have wandered into the forest. Similarly, stray dogs, wolves, and wild boar have also been known to enter the forest area. According to the five though, that wasn't what was happening. They said what started out as the sounds of wildlife turned into heavy, deliberate footsteps all around them. They described feeling an onset of sudden dread as that was happening, and they felt as though they were being encircled. They shone their flashlights into the forest, and they thought that they could see shadows moving, but they couldn't see the animals or people that they belonged to. Not too long after this, still panicked, all five of them reported that they thought they'd heard muffled voices in the distance. But they hadn't seen anyone else in the forest that day, and their calls to them went unanswered. After this, they were thoroughly freaked out, feeling on edge and probably worried about their safety, so they decided that it was time to get out and leave. For some reason, they said that only one of their flashlights was now working, but alongside the moonlight it was enough to find their way out. In the following days, they recounted their incident to locals and the press, which whipped up a frenzy about the place. After hearing this, a second group of locals went in, but they didn't experience anything out of place like the five had reported. In the immediate aftermath of that incident, some had reasoned that air pressure changes could have caused the sudden drop in temperature, and then the other experiences could have been caused by a psychological response triggered by the isolating experience of the forest. To the five though, they thought that there was something more to it, as did many of the locals given the folklore of this place. Another reported incident I came across was that of a separate group of friends who were hiking a trail through the forest. One member separated from the group briefly as he was taking pictures of the strange twisted trees that can be found within. As he stood there with his camera, he said that out of nowhere he started to feel panicky, as if a sudden rush of worry had just engulfed him. In his immediate vicinity, he reported hearing a woman screaming loudly and said that it was like someone was right beside him, but there was nobody there. This caused him to bolt and he sprinted down the trail to his friends. He was pale and his friends hadn't heard any screams or commotion going on other than his panicked running. But now, utterly freaked out, they left. There was also an account from a small group of forest maintenance volunteers who worked for a non-profit organisation inside Cluj-Napoca. They weren't working on this particular occasion, but had planned to camp out in the forest together. It wasn't stated where exactly they were located within, but they'd set up their tents and had retired for the night. Two members of the group awoke to the sounds of footsteps during the early hours of the night. They had expected to see a deer walking around the camp, but upon undoing the zip to their tent, there was nothing there. Like others who had been within the forest before them, they reported this similar feeling of unease and dread, though perhaps understandably so. They weren't able to sleep, and a short time after that, they heard footsteps again and it sounded like an animal, or someone, I suppose, was walking right beside their tent. They waited for a moment and went out again, only to find that there was nobody there for a second time. Weirdly, they stated that this happened once more, only this final time it was much louder and the whole group was now awake and confused. They were absolutely convinced that it sounded like there was a horse galloping about right outside the tents, which made no sense. They just sat and listened for a while before the sound stopped, and they left as soon as the sun came up. Going back to disappearances, it wasn't only the shepherd that supposedly vanished in this place, but rather this forest is quite infamous for people going missing within it, and actually seems to stray into the Missing 411-esque territory with some exaggeration. Or at least, there are similar sounding stories that are talked about by the locals. One such report speaks of a young girl who was on an afternoon outing with her parents, hiking on one of the many trails in the area. At some point on the trail, she was said to have strayed from her parents while following a butterfly. The parents didn't realise just how far she'd managed to get away from them, as when they reached the point that she'd moved out of sight, they couldn't see her. They called out to her, expecting her to come back running, but she didn't. Instead, they found themselves frantically searching the area, calling out loudly into the forest, but at no point receiving a response. Quickly, they realised that this was serious, and the father stayed behind, darting into different directions in the forest, while the mother left to get help. Local authorities, alongside villagers, descended on the forest and combed through it, and later with search dog teams, but no trace of her was found. As the search continued over the following week and no evidence whatsoever was being found, some in the community became suspicious and skeptical of the parents, wondering if they themselves might have been responsible and that this was a purposeful act, or that she had been taken by an opportunistic third party and wasn't even in the forest anymore. The story then takes a turn though, and states that years after the search had concluded, this same girl was found by hikers in the Hoia Baciu forest. It was claimed that when questioned, she had no memory whatsoever of the time that she'd spent missing. While I'm sure that this story may have been inspired by a real disappearance within the forest a long time ago, it's difficult to imagine being missing for 5 years within the area itself, surviving somehow while avoiding everyone, and then just reappearing with no memory all that time later. It's an interesting story though, and actually reminds me vaguely of a disappearance that took place in the US in 2006. Sammy Bokel, 8, went to the Crater Lake National Park with his father, and similar to this girl, Sammy ran ahead, out of sight, and up a hill which had a forest area at the bottom of the slope. When the father reached the top, Sammy was just gone, and despite an incredible search effort involving hundreds upon hundreds of people, along with professional search dog handlers, Sammy nor his remains were ever found. Interestingly enough, there are countless stories and incidents of people going missing in the general area of this forest. The folklore and local stories are packed full of such instances, though, like the girl, they are not always gone forever. Similar stories tell how some are said to have gone on a stroll through the forest, only to emerge confused, seeing that there is an entire search operation underway to retrieve them. To them, they had only been hiking for the afternoon, but to their loved ones back home, they believed that they'd been missing for days. One instance of this speaks of a woman who had gone out hiking in the forest with 3 of her friends. The story states that they had walked along a popular trail together that tourists still use today, and at an intersection, she wanted to cut through the forest along a different path and meet them later along the main trail. Before long, her friends had realised that they'd lost complete track of her, and what began as a brief moment of separation turned into something more alarming as their calls for her went unanswered. They panicked and retraced their steps, entering the path that she'd gone down, but they just couldn't find her. After a number of hours had passed, they found her on the main trail again and said that she was dazed and in a state of confusion. Later on, she told them that they were being ridiculous and that she was never missing and that they'd only been separated for a few minutes. But the group claimed that they'd been searching for hours. Of course, there's a lot to be dubious and skeptical about here, as these stories aren't exactly specific with dates and names and such. I did spend some time looking through newspaper archives to see if I could find any specific reports about such disappearances, though I couldn't find any. That's not to say that they didn't happen though, as searching through press reports that aren't in English isn't easy, not very thorough. And I'd imagine many of their archives are not stored in the kind of places I generally look. Another point too is that going back even a relatively short time means we don't have the printing press. which seems to be the time in which a lot of these stories originated, since they are talked about in the folklore. In more recent times, and because of said folklore, this place has seen more exploration and visits from locals and people abroad who have been drawn to this place. One thing that many people seem to report within the forest is a sense of exaggerated emotions, weirdly enough. Tourists have said that if you go in already feeling happy or low, those feelings sometimes are amplified somehow. Hikers have also explained feeling nauseous suddenly, just out of nowhere while trekking around this place, and then having one of the worst headaches or migraines of their life. In addition to this, other people have stated that upon returning home, they come back with an injury that they didn't even realise sustaining while they were out. Some report irritating, painful scratches and other such things that they weren't aware of before, and were unsure as to when or where they might have taken place. There have also been other health complaints, such as feeling confused, lightheaded, or dazed and disoriented out of nowhere without an understanding as to why. The trees in the forest also brought in some interest from the scientific community, as many of them have strange shapes and forms and seem to grow in unusual positions. Many of them are bent and spiral and seem to twist in a clockwise direction, and it's not clear why these unusual patterns have emerged there. Additionally, the circle in which nothing grows has also attracted research efforts, and various groups have taken soil samples over the years and have been left without much of an answer as to why nothing seems to want to grow there. Locals, whose families have lived nearby for generations, claim that this circular area has been the exact same for at least over 400 years. In 1953, Alexander Sift, a biologist, took an interest in the forest. Specifically, he wanted to understand why the trees in the forest grew the way they did, and why there was an area in which nothing would grow. It's not clear how much time had passed since he began his research, but he himself reported experiencing something unusual. On one excursion, he'd taken his father, whom also had an interest in biology. Their plan was to make their way to this circular area, as his father had never seen it before. After hiking for a while, and upon closing in on it, both reported hearing a sound all around them that they couldn't see the origin for. They reportedly heard what was described as teeth chattering but coming from everywhere. As this was going on, Alexander specifically said that he began to feel nauseous, as though he was going to throw up. They stood close together and were looking around while feeling as though they were being surrounded but couldn't see what was responsible. The sounds eventually stopped, but afterwards, the pair of them stated that they were essentially being gripped by paranoia and anxiety. They were absolutely convinced that they were being followed and thought they could see the silhouettes of other people on occasion, but they would turn around only to find that they were alone. This brought their trip to an early close, and they never even got to the round clearing. Alexander did continue his studies after this outing, so perhaps they left feeling somewhat silly as opposed to anything else, but I'm not sure. I came across this journal, published by the University of Cluj-Napoca. It details the effect that the forest has had on tourism, but more interestingly, it states this: the Hoia Baciu forest enjoys the attention and interest of the media and international researchers since 1968, when the military technician Emil Barnier caught in some of his photographs a strange shape hovering in the sky over the area of Poia Rotunda within the forest. This is the picture being referred to. What was interesting about Emil, as far as I can tell, is that he didn't know too much about the forest, but rather was just on a day out with his wife and another couple that they were friends with. At some point while in the forest, they reportedly saw a brief light beyond the tree line and assumed that someone had a flashlight or something similar. Not long afterwards, the group saw that odd shape in the sky, whatever it was, and snapped the picture. All four of them described that it was silent, just hovering with a stillness, and then at some point emitted a light before disappearing suddenly. Taking this picture actually turned out to be a mistake by Emil, because he believed that they'd seen and captured something on camera that was quite profound. He passed it on to local newspapers, but this would end up in Emil losing his job with the military. I'm not sure what the exact justification for that was, and all I can find online is that it seemed to have something to do with those in charge of the nation at that time and their aversion to anything out of the ordinary being discussed. Or perhaps they thought that it was rubbish and that he was exploiting his trusted position. One way or another, whatever the reasoning may have been, he did lose his role as a result. A number of years after that incident, in 1974, a chemist by the name of Adrian Petrup, who earned his PhD from the university in Cluj-Napoca, became interested in the forest after learning about the episode with the mill and learning of Alexander's work. Outside of chemistry, Adrian had a deep interest in psychology, and he wanted to understand why there were so many reports of unusual experiences coming from within the forest. I get the impression that Adrian may have thought that it was rubbish at first until he himself reported an unusual experience of his own. During one of his hikes, he documented seeing what he described as a weird light that was floating in the distance. He described it as being small and seeming to hover without any identifiable source, meaning I assume he didn't believe that it was a flashlight or anything like that. He said that it was erratic and seemed to respond to his movement as he couldn't get closer to it, believing that it was moving away from him. Interestingly, like others who believed that they'd experienced something out of the ordinary, he said that it was accompanied by a feeling of unease and dread. He first wondered whether what he was seeing might have been related to strange atmospheric effects, such as ball lightning, but he didn't believe that this was the case as it had gone on for too long, whereas ball lightning doesn't last for very long usually. This actually led to a hypothesis that I find quite compelling in this case. One thing that stuck with Adrian was the fact that during these incidents that so many people, including himself, had reported, often they are accompanied with hearing something strange and out of place, having an intense emotional reaction, or feeling nauseous during it. This led to an interesting hypothesis that all of these strange experiences that had been reported over the years might have been the result of some weird interaction with weather events coupled with the unique topography of the area, among other such things. After all, these experiences don't occur every single time tour groups go into the forest. According to Adrian, this combination of variables might somehow be producing infrasound within the forest. These sounds have been known to be emitted by natural events such as earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, and thunderstorms, among others. And there will likely be a whole host of factors that we don't understand yet and aren't even aware of. Specifically, infrasound refers to sound waves with frequencies lower than the limit that we can actually hear, usually below 20 Hz. They are so low that they are not perceptible to us at all, though they can have physical effects on the body and also the environment. While this has been less studied and more research in this field is required, studies do seem to indicate that certain types of sound frequencies can enhance growth in various vegetation, including cotton plants for example. We also know that some infrasounds can cause what is known as mechanical stress in plant tissues, which seems to negatively affect nutrient uptake. Some limited experiments have also indicated that prolonged exposure to these sounds seem to stunt growth and decrease biomass. Therefore, while highly speculative, it might not be too surprising to learn that high-intensity infrasound could theoretically damage growth, which could be an explanation for the circular area where nothing grows, which is why the soil samples were not suggesting anything unusual or contaminants being present. I found this particularly interesting because Adrian himself tried to invoke infrasound as a potential explanation to the unusual reports and incidents within the forest. Though, while I'm not sure he applied that hypothesis to the strange tree formations and lack of plant growth in the area, he was more concerned with applying it to the human experiences within it. As gone over, many people, while having such an experience in the forest, have reported certain physiological and psychological responses, such as intense emotion, anxiety, dread, nausea, and headaches. Interestingly enough, people who have been exposed to such infrasounds have also reported feeling discomfort, heightened anxiety, nausea, headaches, and a general sense of unease, which is almost a one-to-one with what people have reported feeling within the forest over the many years. The exact mechanisms as to why this occurs is not fully understood. We know though that they cause vibrations within the body, particularly the head and chest. It might be the case that these vibrations actually resonate with internal organs or tissues, leading to distress and discomfort. Low-frequency sounds have been found to affect structures inside the head, such as sinuses, the eyes, and the brain. There have been lots of reports also of people feeling suddenly disoriented and confused within the forest. While this does not explain the report of a person's compass going wild, these infrasounds can affect the vestibular system, which is responsible for balance and spatial orientation. Certain frequencies quite literally lead to imbalance and disorientation, because the sound, for some reason, leads to the brain receiving conflicting information and senses that I suppose it just wasn't designed to deal with. In addition to all of this, not only can infrasound induce fear, anxiety, and this sense of dread that has been described, it has also been linked to inducing hallucinations. That could, for example, explain the situation in which the man who separated from his group briefly to take pictures thought he'd heard a woman screaming right next to him. I'm not sure how that would explain the group experiences though, where multiple people, assuming that they are telling the truth of course, such as Alexander and his father, who reported seeing shadows moving and feeling as though they were being surrounded. I'm not sure how it would explain the group experience. I'm also not sure how it would explain the group experience of all of the campers hearing footsteps outside their tents and horses galloping. If infrasound was to blame for that, it likely would affect everyone at the same time, but it's very difficult to imagine that they'd all start hearing and experiencing the exact same thing. In other words, while the idea of infrasound affecting an individual's perceptions and emotions does seem to offer a plausible explanation for some of these strange experiences, it might not account for the more collective experiences. The fact that multiple people, spanning many years, hundreds and hundreds actually, when you take into account the folklore, have reported similar things at the same time, the shadows, noises, lights, and other such things, that could raise the question that there might be more to it. After a little further reading, I just wanted to add on the end here, I did find out that in tourist, haunted house type events that are put on, some of them utilise infrasound to make the experiencer feel like there is something more to it. In fact, scientists have theorised that people who believe there is something unseen lurking in their home with them might be responding to the presence of infrasound that they're just not aware of. And there seems to be a body of research in favour of that, which is fascinating. I wonder just how many unusual things, or sights, the presence of infrasound might help to explain in the end. Anyway, with that, I'll leave it there. What do you make of this forest? Do you think the infrasound explanation holds weight? Or do you think there's something even more out of the ordinary taking place with these kind of locations? I hope you found this one interesting. I'd just like to take the time to thank you for watching, and a big thank you to the patrons who've been running around on the screen. If you enjoyed this video, please do remember to like and subscribe if you haven't already. If you didn't like it, then feel free to give me a thumbs down. I'm just looking for your honest opinion either way. I hope that you've had a great day, or evening, depending on where you are, and I'll see you in the next one. Be safe guys. Peace.